Module 5. Today we'll be discussing training data generation, labeled queries, and entity mapping. So let's talk about training data. Supervised machine learning has proven to be highly successful and is widely used in conversational agents. MindMeld in particular can be considered a hybrid ML system where it has a number of components that are supervised components in that they use supervised machine learning to train, and the rest of the components are rule-based. Depending on your application, you may need training data for the following areas: domain classification, intent classification, entity recognition, role classification, and entity resolution. Domain classification is a text classification problem that determines what the domain of a particular query is. This is the top level classification for a chatbot. Intent classification zooms in on this a little bit further. Once the domain has been determined, it then determines the intent within that domain. So if the domain is everything related to ordering food, the intent might be to actually create the order or finalize the order and start giving the payment details, etc., etc. So you can create a sub-intent within the overall domain. Next, we have the entity recognizer. This can identify important sub-text or words within the sentence, and can also figure out what is the value of those words. It might find that those two words in a sentence, Pizza Hut, are actually it's actually the name of a restaurant. Role classification is similar, where we find an entity, for example, create a meeting from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. In this case, 4 p.m. and 5 p.m. are both system time entities, but the role of 4 p.m. is the start time, and the role of 5 p.m. is the end time. And lastly, we have entity resolution. So what are labeled queries? Labeled queries files are text files containing example user queries. MindMeld then uses them to train its domain and intent classification models. It also uses them to train all other models just previously discussed. Labeled query files also support an inline markup syntax for annotating queries and entity roles within each query. These annotations are used to train both the entity and role classification models. All labeled query files belong to the domains folder, and each domain and intent subfolder should contain labeled query files that apply only to that intent. So let's take a look at what these labeled queries are. Once we have our domain folder in our application file, we can then specify the subdomain by the next level of folders within it. In this case, the first domain is store info. Inside of store info, we see that there are 5 different intents: exit, find nearest store, get store hours, greet, and help. Each of these intents have their own train.txt file. This is key. The train.txt file contains example queries that are relevant to that particular intent. So let's take a look over here. When does Elm Street store close? Now you notice this interesting markup in this query. This is the MindMeld syntax markup that essentially follows the structure of entity name, pipe, entity type. And this notifies the MindMeld system that you have some text in here or entities that are really key to your query and should be resolved and stored into the context frame once the query is processed, so that it can be used by your rule-based logic downstream. Let's take a look at another example. What are the hours of the Quickie Mart on Main Street? Here we have another store name. Is the Central Plaza Quickie Mart open now? Is another name, and so on. Is the Rockefeller, which is a store name, Quickie Mart open for business tomorrow, sys_time. So here we see a new system entity that is being specified, sys_time. There's no limit to the number of entities that you could define here. You could define sys_time or all the system entities that are already predefined. If you do define a custom entity, you will have to specify that in the entity folder. But we will get to how to specify the custom entities in a later slide. For now, what's important to know is that every single intent folder has its own train.txt file, which contains the example queries for that intent, and each of the queries are marked up using MindMeld syntax in order to specify the entities in those queries as well as the entity types. Now let's talk about the entity mapping files. So we said that store name is an example of a custom entity. Now in order to make this example, in our app folder, we need to specify the entities folder, which will contain store name. And store name will have two files. For each entity defined in the entities folder would have two files. The first is the gazetteer.txt, and the second is the mapping.txt file. And these contain whitelisted alternative names or synonyms with individual entities. MindMeld uses entity mappings to train the models required for entity resolution. So let's look at an example of a mapping.json file. Here we see the ID, the canonical store name, so this is Pine and Market, and the whitelist means what are the different ways that you could refer to this particular entity, because it's not always the case that someone will refer to some entity in the same way. For example, Central Plaza, someone might say, hey, I'd like a pizza from Central, or Main Street Plaza, or 100 Main, or 100 Main Street. How do we make sure that all of these examples are being routed to or being resolved to being the same thing, so that in our application we don't need to worry about having separate if statements for all of these cases. Instead, we can have one if statement on the canonical name. So that is the job that MindMeld takes care of, so long as you provided the information that says, hey, this is the canonical name I'm looking for, and here are the different ways that we could possibly say it. Now, where is this data stored? As a recap, we will put all training data in the domains folder with a train.txt file inside of each of the intent folders. And all custom entities that are specified will be inside of the entities folder with a gazetteer file and a mappings.json file. The mappings.json file tells you what are the other ways or synonyms for a given entity. And this concludes the creation of training data in your MindMeld application.